Good evening, welcome to this video. Today we have it's the beginning, should I say, of the Should You Talisman for tanks. And we're going to be starting off with the LVT A1 for the US. I was going to start off with the Stuart, but I figured I'd start off with something a little bit more unique and a little bit more special in that regard. So, for those that have never watched a plane version of this series, this is going to be a little bit different to the planes. Obviously, we're not going to be taking a flight. We're not going to be looking at... I mean, if we think about it, the LVT could probably take flight if you shoved it off a cliff, but that's not the point. We're going to be taking a look at the vehicle's gun, armor, and things like that. So just overall the vehicle itself. So I'll probably class that as something like vehicle overview if you're looking for the timestamp, because there will be timestamps in the description below as per usual. Then of course we'll go for a drive, take a look at the vehicle and see how it handles on the range as well, with the gun performance and the overall driving ability of the vehicle. Then we'll take a look at the, shall we say, the vehicles that it has to compete with, and then of course we will come to a conclusion based off of that. It's very similar to the planes, except we're going to be, of course, taking a look a bit more in depth of the armor and things like that. The gun performance, the shells, things like that. So these tank ones might be a little bit longer than your typical plane ones. That's why, like the planes, they are provided with the typical timestamps. But anyway, because most people have the attention span of 1 minute because of TikTok and YouTube Shorts, we will now begin with the LVT. So we're going to be taking a look at the armor first, and of course, being an amphibious tank, the armor is not exactly stellar, with it being 6.35mm in most parts, with the exceptions being the frontal hull area here, and the turret. The turret is of course going to be mainly 12.7, which is half an inch, and then of course we have the gun mantlet, which is the strongest part of the vehicle. Was this turret front English? This turret mantlet won't really stop a lot, but if we go to protection analysis, it can at least mostly stop some of the guns that you're going to meet. The problem is if people are shooting your turret, they're probably just going to aim around it and overmatch the sides like this due to the welding and stuff like that. And not only that, people tend to shoot the hull, and as you'll see here, the hull is very easy to penetrate, and well, yeah. The armor on this thing is not particularly amazing anyway, really. It's 6.35mm on nearly everywhere part of the vehicle, with some parts being between half an inch and just under half an inch, and then of course the 2-inch gun mantlet, which I mentioned earlier. This tank is very vulnerable to planes, it's very vulnerable to artillery due to its large size and poor armor, and just overall, the armor is not why you drive this vehicle. So why do you drive this vehicle? Well, for a start, the mobility. Whilst it is quite heavy at 14.9 tons, its engine produces a decent bit of horsepower. Now, it isn't the highest, and of course this is a slower vehicle compared to the Stuart, but of course this vehicle is still nippy enough to get, shall we say, around the battlefield in due course. And of course, another reason why you'd probably play the LVT is the survivability. This vehicle does have decent survivability, having 6 crew members. In other words, your opponent must take out 5 crew members to destroy the vehicle, or of course ammo rack it, but I don't think I've ever been ammo racked in an LVT, so that just tells you. Of course, you have your driver, your bow gunner, who literally does nothing because there's no hull mounted machine gun. You then have these 2 guys in the back who also function as machine gunners, so these machine guns do operate, although they have limited firing arcs. And then, of course, you come to the main part of the crew, which is the commander / loader, and, of course, the gunner. This vehicle does have good survivability, but, of course, with the armor being so poor, it's very easy to take out the crew members if you're not aware of the enemy that you're facing. Particularly autocannons tend to be quite dangerous to this sort of vehicle. Now, of course, we come to the gun, the 37mm M6 cannon. This will be a familiar cannon in the low tiers of USA, and it is a very good cannon. And, well, we're going to get into the shells in a moment. But of course, the turret traverse on this vehicle is pretty fast. It does come with 10 degrees of gun depression. The vertical elevation is not great, but the horizontal traverse is actually pretty good at 20.4 degrees a second. Now, of course, that isn't maxed out because this is on a... Well, this is on a very high level crew, as you can tell. It's actually on a max crew. But, of course, I don't have an expert qualification or the ace qualification. Remember, though, crew skills do matter for these vehicles. So, something like the turret traverse, you could get this up to 24 degrees a second if you had an ace and expert crew on the vehicle. So, a fully spec'd out LVT will be around 5% or 20% faster than a typical LVT in this current configuration with just maxed out targeting. And of course, maxed out leadership, because this also applies. Just bear that in mind. But of course, the top speed of the vehicle is pretty okay at 25 miles per hour, as I mentioned before. The reverse does let you down, but it's reserved here. There's hardly anything with a decent reverse here. And now we move on to the shell, which, well, you start off with this shell. As soon as you can, research this shell, the M51B1. This is going to be the only shell you should be carrying. It has 87mm of penetration at 10 meters on a flat surface. It also goes up to around 1000 meters, which can pen 60 at a flat angle, 47 at 30 degrees, and 22 at 60. So the penetration is really, really consistent and will pretty much punch through anything that you're going to meet. With some exception, such as gun mantlets on certain vehicles and things like that. But otherwise, the gun on this vehicle will be more than adequate to take out anything that you run into, including some of the big heavies that you might run into, because they generally don't have much in the way of armor anyway. It's normally crew count they tend to rely on. So overall, the armor, whilst it isn't very good, the gun definitely makes up for it. So does the mobility, because the US tanks normally do tend to have pretty good mobility, with some exceptions, of course. So, how about we go for a little drive and see how this vehicle handles? I'll see you on the range. And welcome to the test drive. I know I called it the range, but well, it kind of is a range because we can actually shoot at things. So as I said, the LVT does, of course, have amphibious abilities, which they won't come into the play much. But as you can tell by the acceleration, even though it's quite large if we park it next to this truck, its acceleration isn't that bad. But of course, this LVT can actually run into this vehicle, this SDKFC 6.2 here. And of course, not having a high explosive shell does mean you're going to have to either shoot it like that, or use the multitude of machine guns that are mounted on the vehicle. Because as I said, there's two in the back, and there's also one mounted coaxially with the main gun. But of course, shooting at a light target isn't really going to be valid to talk about, because, well, you could kill that truck with a coax. How does it do against, let's say, a Panzer II? Well, obviously I'm using it for an example. The Panzer II is probably the most dangerous vehicle you're going to run into, other than something like a German anti-aircraft vehicle. The Panzer IVs can overpress you with heat, so they're also pretty dangerous as well. But in general, it's going to be the German vehicles you have to be very careful of. And there are going to be some parts where your gun just can't, whilst it can go through in some areas, it does tend to struggle on some parts of it. But generally, you can pretty much just pen the Panzer II pretty much anywhere, with a couple of exceptions. But just remember, he can do the same to you. But as you saw there, the reload rate of this vehicle really helps it out. So having something like against the Panzer IV, if of course you don't bounce like that, which can happen, if you manage to take out that sort of shot, you have all the time in the world to just line up another shot with this thing's reload rate, with it being so good, and just take them out. Now, Panzer IIs, as I briefly mentioned, they are very... well, they're not very good for the vehicle, as I've said before. But, of course, your mobility can mostly match them, and, well, yeah. I've got to show off the amphibious abilities, haven't I? At least once. So, as mentioned, obviously this isn't exactly a great environment for this vehicle, but the LVT can swim. Are you ever going to use this in a real-life match? Probably not, because, well, you never do. This vehicle doesn't really get to show this ability off. But as I mentioned, the vehicle's driving ability is actually pretty generous. It drives very well, but of course getting out the water can be a little bit of trouble due to the small tracks. And as you can see, it's actually trying to fight me here because it doesn't like it. But of course the machine guns in the back, as I said, they do work, but they're only ready for light stuff. Your main weapon, of course, is the 37mm, but as you can see, I can't fire over the back. Once I get it between the two machine gunners, though, I perfectly can. So just bear that in mind if you are going to use this vehicle. But overall, it's got pretty decent power. Like, it gets where it needs to go pretty nicely. Its traverse on the spot is also pretty good. If I pull to a stop here to demonstrate, it does turn pretty well on the spot for how big it is. But of course, if you're coming around a corner like this, and an enemy is parked, let's say, right there, you can very easily have your transmission or driver taken out, and they can just shoot your driver or whatever over and over again. There has been situations where I've had this happen, and I've also done it to other LVTs. So just bear that in mind when it comes to overall ability of the vehicle. But of course, as I said, it drives very nicely. So if you're a new player, it definitely can get around the battlefield nicely, and it drives really smoothly for how big it is. But does that mean you should talisman this vehicle? Well, let's go back to the hangar and take a look at its competition. Because I tell you right now, I wouldn't talisman this thing, no matter how fun it can be. I'll see you all in a moment. And welcome back to the hangar. As you can probably tell, the US tech tree doesn't have a huge amount in the low tiers, but there is still a very valid vehicle to put the LVT up against. If you skipped here from the beginning because you just want to find out what I prefer over the LVT, that's fair enough, because there's actually a couple of answers to this. So to start off with, we're going to look at the Stuart, which of course will be in the next episode. This vehicle combines a higher level of mobility, even more horsepower, as well as lighter weight, and well, I say arguably, better armor in nearly every single location bar the gun mantlet, which I think is like a similar thickness, if memory serves me correctly. But you do trade off for a slightly slower turret traverse. That's pretty much all you trade off with the M24. Otherwise, it's all just benefit. As I said though, the turret traverse on the LVT is a little bit higher, but of course this is base crew, so if we actually put this on my current crew, which is here, it's pretty close to the LVT's turret traverse at 19.3. Obviously this was at like 20 on my best crew, but of course the M24 does have an expert crew. The LVT had a 20 on even a non-expert crew, so just bear that in mind. One vehicle I wouldn't suggest ever talismaning is the M2 Medium. This is a terrible tank, but I don't really need to introduce yourself to that if you've actually played it. The M22 is a fun little tank, and whilst I wouldn't advise it for a newer player, whilst it is very fun, the vehicle that I'm going to suggest completely blows the LVT out the park. Either the M3A1 Stuart or the M3. The M3A1 Stuart has a stabilizer that's very similar to a Sherman, which, trust me, this stabilizer will save you a lot of the time. Now, the LVT does have a stabilizer of its own, but I believe, if memory serves me correctly, it's a shoulder mount. So as you can see here, the gunner's right arm and shoulder is actually supporting the gun. So whilst the LVT can technically use a stabilizer, it is nowhere near as good as the M3A1, I should say. Not only that, the M3A1 comes with, once again, better mobility, much better armor, which in some places is actually thicker than the LVT's gun mantlet, and just overall, this vehicle is far more versatile. Now sure, this vehicle does have to deal with 3.3 matchmaking, which is very tricky for this vehicle sometimes, but, I mean, this vehicle is just so versatile, and I really have no complaints about it. Whilst the turret traverse is, of course, on base crew at the minute, same with the reload rate, you're really just gaining more benefit over the LVT, and I really don't see a reason why you should talisman the LVT. And then, of course, we come to the tank destroyers, and even the AA is actually pretty decent, but I wouldn't recommend talismaning an AA, that's not the point. But of course, when it comes to the tank destroyers, we have the M3 GMC, which this thing really needs no introduction. It packs a 75mm gun, which is very similar to a Sherman's gun. It's kind of a relative to the Sherman's gun. And whilst it doesn't have anywhere near as much armor as the LVT in some places, because, well, you're in a half track, you don't really need it. You have mobility, which this thing's also pretty fast at 45 miles per hour. The fact is, you get M61 shot, which is, again, going to be very familiar to Sherman players later down the line. This is incredible at 1.7, and before the M3 got a buff, it used to have, I believe, an 11-second reload on like a decent crew. But if I put it on one of my better crews, as you can see there, 6.4 seconds on a Sherman gun at 1.7, and you can sling some HE if you need to. Yeah. I really don't see a point to the LVT, that's for sure. And with that, we move on to the conclusion. The conclusion is, do not put the talisman on the LVT. I got this years ago for a talisman, and I remember when I got it, because it was not long after the vehicle actually came out, which proves how long ago this was. But the problem is that, as I've shown, multiple vehicles around its BR range are just better than it, and even at the M3A1 is technically not in the same BR bracket because it's 2.3. The LVT will never meet it. The LVT just cannot compete when it comes to the M2A4 Stuart, let alone the M3A1 Stuart. So yeah, in conclusion, do not talisman the LVT-A1, and well, hopefully the next vehicle in the series, which, as I said, is going to be the M2A4, this thing will definitely get something positive if you are looking, of course, to talisman a rank 1 vehicle, which I don't advise, but that doesn't mean you can't do it if you're looking for some harmless fun. Anyway, I'm going to leave you all to it for today. I hope you enjoyed seeing the first tank episode of Should You Talisman, and I will see you all on the next one.